Okay, Chapter 2, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. We heard in Chapter 1, we met the narrator, Nick, kind of quirky guy who says he's not judgmental, but he seems to be anyway. We met his cousin, Daisy. We met Daisy's friend, Miss Baker. We met Daisy's husband, Tom Buchanan. He seems kind of like a pushy kind of guy, big athlete, but then he ends up saying something racist. So Nick goes home and back to his little apartment, and he lives next door to a really big house owned by somebody named Gatsby. He sees Gatsby on the lawn right at the end. Gatsby looks like he's looking out at the water across the bay, stretching out his arms, but there's nothing out there except a little tiny green light at the end of somebody's dock. Um, and so, Chapter 2. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort of men who move dimly and are already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak and comes to rest, and immediately the ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operations from your sight. So that seems like the picture of a bunch of people working in some kind of industrial area and loading up some trains. Okay, but above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their irises are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non existent nose. Evidently, some wild wag of an oculist set them up there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under the sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. Apparently, there's a billboard put up by a eyeglass salesperson, and the billboard's still there, constantly going to be referred to as the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Very symbolic. We'll find out what they mean later. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small, foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let the barges through, the passengers on waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There's always a halt there for at least a minute, and it was because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular restaurants with her, and, leaving her at her table, sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her. But I did. I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, and when we stopped by the ash heaps, he jumped to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he tanked up a good deal at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was that on a Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence, and we walked back 100 yards along the road under Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small block of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street, ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the three shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant, approached by a trail of ashes. The third, was a garage. Repairs. George B. Wilson. Cars bought and sold. And I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic, and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old man," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," answered Wilson unconvincingly. When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. I got my man working on it now." He works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he doesn't," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else, after all." I didn't mean that," explained Wilson quickly. I just meant—" His voice faded off, and Tom, glancing impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and in a moment the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in the middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. And then she wet her lips, and without turning around, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down?" Oh, sure," agreed Wilson hurriedly, and went towards the little office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and his pale hair, as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved closer to Tom. "I want to see you." "No, this is Tom." "I want to see you," said Tom intently. "Get on the next train." "All right." "I'll meet you by the newsstand on the lower level." She nodded and moved away from him just as George Wilson emerged with 2 chairs from his office door. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a gray, scrawny Italian child was setting up torpedoes in a row along the railroad track. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "Awful." "It does her good to get away." "Doesn't her husband object?" "Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb, he doesn't even know he's alive." So Tom Buchanan and his girl and I went up together to New York. Or not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. They're on the train. Tom deferred that much to the sensibilities of those East Eggers who might be on the train. She had changed her dress to a brown-figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips, as Tom helped her to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and a moving picture magazine, and in the station drugstore some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. Upstairs, in the solemn echoing drive, she let 4 taxi... Upstairs, in the solemn echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before she selected the new one, a lavender-colored one with gray upholstery, and this one we slid out from the mass of the station into the growing sunshine. But immediately she turned sharply from the window and, leaning forward, tapped on the front glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said earnestly. "I want to get one for the apartment. They're nice to have, a dog." We backed up to a gray old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket, swung from his neck, cowered a dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Miss Wilson eagerly, as he came to the taxi minutes. "All kinds. What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs. I don't suppose you got that kind." The man peered doubtfully into the basket. plunged in his hand and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "Nah, it's not exactly a police dog," said the man with the disappointment in his voice. "It's more of an Airedale." He passed his hands over the brown wash rag of a back. "Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching a cold." "I think it's cute," said Mrs. Wilson enthusiastically. "How much is it?" "That dog?" He looked at it admiringly. "That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale, undoubtedly there was an Airedale concerned in it somewhere, though its feet were startlingly white, changed hands and settled down onto Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked delicately. That dog's a boy." "It's a bitch," said Tom decisively. "Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it." We drove over to the Fifth Avenue, so warm and soft, almost pastoral in the summer Sunday afternoon, that I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn in the corner. "Hold on," I said. "I have to leave you here." "Oh, no, you don't," interposed Tom quickly. "Myrtle'll be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment. Won't you, Myrtle?" "Come on," she urged. "I'll telephone my sister Catherine. She said she'd be very beautiful. She's said to be very beautiful by people who want to know." "Well, I'd like to, but—" We went on, cutting back again over the park towards the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, the cab stopped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up her dog and the other purchases and went haughtily in. "I'm going to have the McGee's come up," she announced as we rose in the elevator. "And of course, I got to call up my sister, too." The apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with a set of tapestried furniture entirely too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continuously over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. The only picture was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently of a hen sitting on a blurred rock. Looked at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance of a stout old lady beamed down into the room. Several old copies of the Town Tattle lay on the table together with a copy of Simon Called Peter and some of the small scandal magazines of Broadway. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large, hard dog biscuits, one of which completely decomposed apathetically in the saucer of the milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau drawer. A reminder of the time period, we're talking 1920s. So we're seeing cars, which are relatively new, gas stations, which are relatively new. They take the train to the city, and they're bringing out liquor, which of course had been prohibited. And in the 1920s, alcohol was all over the place. And that particular period in time was referred to as the Roaring Twenties because of the boom after World War I. Okay. Nick is still talking. "I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened was a dim, hazy cast over it, although until after 8 o'clock, the apartment was full of cheerful sun. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone, and then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff, or the whiskey distorted things, because it didn't make any sense." Just after Tom and Myrtle, after the first drink, Mrs. Wilson and I called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced to arrive at the apartment door. So apparently Tom and Myrtle disappeared into another room for a while.